Hello, I'm Larry Johnson, and welcome to this presentation by the International Unity Club. I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Alexander Kazakov. He is the Deputy Co-Chairman of the International Unity Club, and we are honored to have today with us Alexander Babakov, the Deputy Chairman of the Duma, but I'll leave it to my colleague, the other Alexander, to do the introduction.
Well, generally, Alexander Babakov needs a long introduction, including introduction for the benefit of our future interlocutors. But I'll introduce him for our audience and the American audience. In Russia, his title is Deputy Chairman of the State Duma of the Russian Federation. In the US, he would be the Vice Speaker of the lower chamber of Congress. For the benefit of our audience here and for our guests, it is crucial to understand that Alexander Babakov is a researcher and a scientist, and it is wonderful that our legislators are scientists. Alexander Babakov specializes in political sciences, and in addition to that, Alexander Babakov is a special envoy of our president. And actually, Alexander Babakov basically covers the whole of the world because he represents the interests of our compatriots. And Alexander Babakov has other separate focus areas in the lower chamber of our parliament. On the one hand, he leads a working group on the development of international economic cooperation. But as far as I understand, it is a working group that is focused on development of counteractions against unfriendly actions against our country in the sphere of economy. Is my understanding correct? I'll explain that, says Alexander Babakov. And the other focus area for Alexander Babakov is the following. As the Vice Speaker, he is in charge of a big number of foreign economic and foreign affairs activities in China, India, Iran, Iraq, and the Persian Gulf countries, Africa, Central and South America. When I read the list of countries you have to cover, I was amazed. I cannot understand how you can absorb such a big volume of information. Please welcome Alexander Babakov. Larry, let me hand over to you to ask your question.
Okay. We're still waiting. We're going to be joined by a couple of gentlemen, Judge Napolitano from the United States, and then Professor Mohammed Sayed Marandi, currently of Iran, but, when you press him, you find out he was born in Virginia. So I bet you didn't know that he was actually an American, but he's a good friend of mine as well. What would you say is the number one legislative priority right now for the Duma?
Well, at the moment, priority number one is adoption of the budget, which is treated as a law for the next 3 years. And this is the law our country will abide by starting in the year of 2026. It is a traditional procedure. Our planning horizon is 3 year long. We adopt a 3-year budget, but we are aware of the fact that the present day situation stimulates the government to extend the planning horizon because it characterizes the current dynamic of international economic relations. The government has an idea about how our economy will develop within the next 10 or 15 years, but we are adopting a 3-year budget. Today was the second reading when we were voting for amendments, and we spent quite a lot of enough time. There will be the third reading shortly, then we'll adopt it as a law and we'll send it to the president. Will there be a shutdown? No, there will be no shutdown. We've been working very closely with the government and we fully understand the current situation.
Yeah, you don't want to behave like the Americans. So, yeah.
No, we don't.
And, you folks are not familiar with deficit spending, where, in the United States, we keep borrowing money that we don't have. But right now, the debt to GDP ratio is like 126% in the United States. In Russia, I think it's 19%. So you've already set an example for being fiscally responsible. Has the policies of the central bank, Ms. Nabiullina, has that created some problems or tensions with the Duma, or is it something that there's general acceptance that the policy to clamp down on inflation is something that most welcome?
Let me start with the second part of your question, because it is indeed very important, and I am grateful for this question, because in fact we need to understand that economic processes and economic laws are objective realities, and these are not laws that are adopted by our Duma or the US Congress, because our actions as legislators, our activities have to rely on knowledge of such laws and awareness of such laws, and then our actions will stimulate such economic laws. If we do not understand economic laws, then we can adopt bills that will run contrary to objective economic laws, and that may create a disbalance. What you called a deficit, it is not a problem for any country, but I'm very grateful for the question, because both American and our viewers would find it important to understand that budget deficit is not a problem. The problem is servicing the sovereign debt that any country has. There is a domestic or internal and external government debt or sovereign debt. And usually when we say debt, it is a liability to a third party. If a government owes itself, it is not a liability, it is an accounting entry. What we are observing in the United States and what we are observing here in any country as well, it is a situation that is associated with a lack of understanding of what's going on. I can see that our guest has joined us, but I'll just finish off what I've been saying. The budget of 19% versus GDP is not a big number, but in the United States it's much larger. But the percentage, the interest rate that the United States government will have to pay for using the debt is very high. The interest rate is very high. This is why President Trump is fighting to reduce the Federal Reserve System interest rate, because it is crucial for him to understand how much the government would have to pay. But we have to take into account that the Federal Reserve System is a private organization that actually gives money to the government, and the problem is not the amount of the sovereign debt, but how you service it. No country can do without deficit, but there are some reasonable ranges that we have to stick to. It is a very important question, but we need to look at it from the economic perspective without speculation.
Great. Well, now I'll bring in my friend, Professor Marandi. Of course, I'm going to give him a hard time. I gave him a Hawaiian shirt, and he's not wearing it.
This is Larry's brand style. He usually wears Hawaiian shirts in his podcast.
That's because it's warm where I live, so I can understand it. So, Professor Marandi, meet Mr. Babakov, and the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you very much, Larry.
Should we introduce Alexander Babakov
I think
to Professor?
Did you hear the introduction earlier?
Oh, whatever you like. I'm whatever you think is best.
Did you hear the introduction of Mr. Babakov earlier? You know who he is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
Okay, good.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one word. Sorry, I forgot to mention it. Alexander Babakov is on the list of champions, of sanctions champions. He was sanctioned by the Obama and Biden administration starting in 2014. He's on the top 10 list, a champion.
Well, we'll go to another champion from Iran.
Thank you. First, I have to apologize to Larry for not wearing the shirt. I do promise to wear it as soon as possible. My question really, well, there are a couple of questions, but my first question, and I know it's something uncomfortable, and I don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable, is the issue of Gaza and Palestine. And the blame for what is going on in Gaza is obviously the Israeli regime, its racist ideology, and its Western backers. And the rest of the world has not participated in this genocide. But at the UN Security Council, I think that many were expecting the Russian Federation to block the resolution, although I personally did not think that that would happen. But my question is, taking into account where we stand right now, Russian Federation do to support the Palestinian people and to bring an end to this misery? Because Trump has no ambition or no intention of helping the Palestinians. He's a staunch ally of Netanyahu, and any differences they may have are not going to make that much of a difference in their general outlook. On the other hand, the Russian Federation, by supporting the Palestinian people, by taking the cause as their own, would make themselves very popular across the global majority.
Well, let's start with the discomfort. Well, we in Russia does not feel any discomfort regarding this matter. Our president and our foreign policy branch of the government has always supported the decisions that were adopted when regarding the establishment of the Palestine state. And it is unlikely that I will say something that is different to the foreign policy course of our country. I think that the key solution to the conflict would be complying with the UN decision to create the Palestinian state in accordance with the frontiers as were defined, because any distortion of the sense that was embodied in the document at that time leads to the fact that we are going astray, going away from the real process. Actually, protection of lives is perhaps the goal of any government, whether these people are the citizens of this state or not, or whether we're talking about international community. Any violence against any citizen of any state has to be prosecuted. No one has the right to dispose of people's lives. What we have been observing in the Gaza Strip, that there is a certain group of countries and national leaders on the global stage who want to actually take that right and proclaim it their own. We need to rely on the international community and reinstate the role and authority of the UN, and insist not only on the fact that any bloodshed has to be stopped, but we need to create the right terms and conditions so that the problems, the root causes of of such events are eradicated. And a solution would be making sure that the Palestine nation, the people of Palestine, have their own state. Any other solutions lead us to a cul-de-sac without creating the Palestine state, without granting the right institute to Palestinian people to enable them to be an actor in the world arena. It would be impossible to resolve this conflict. Of course, we need to be mindful of terrorist activities, but this is a consequence. The key thing is making the decision and protecting the Palestine state and establishing that state legally. And the subsequent steps would be analyzing the previous events and making the right decisions, whether negative against those who committed crimes and positive decisions related to those who try to revive the life in the region.
My second question has more to do with the Caucasus and Central Asia. Although I do think this whole west of Asia and the events there are linked in some way or form to almost everything that happens in Central Asia and the Caucasus in one form or another. But the question that I think many have is that, and again, it may be a question that is not, it could cause some discomfort, not yourself, but that is that many believe that ever since the war in Ukraine began, the Russian government has put less focus on the Caucasus and Central Asia. And the United States, NATO, have been trying to make inroads in these sensitive areas. And we all know that they have terrorist organizations based in Syria that have been trained by NATO. We know that to disrupt the unity and the stability of the Caucasus through divisions between different countries. What is the Russian Federation's policy as we speak about U.S. ambitions in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and what are the Russians going to do to maintain stability?
Russia has been doing and will do one and the same thing. It will assert its own interests and protect its own interests and create the right conditions so that not only our neighbors but other nations will be guided by Russian policy. There is a very important aspect in your question. The events that are happening in the Caucasus and Central Asia are the result of the efforts of those countries, and in particular the United States and European countries who are interested in preserving a unipolar world. Actually, there is some duplicity in approaches to any matters that, but many people are still trying to apply that duplicity, and this and there is a tenacious attitude to preserve it, and therefore there are ideological, diplomatic, economic prerequisites created to actually stir unrest, as we say, unrest in those countries. The events unfolding in Ukraine were born not by the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, but the West, as represented by NATO, has practically entered the home of Russia. And all politicians need to ask this question: how would they behave if there are trespassers in their house with military equipment and soldiers? Not to say hello, not to say that we are bringing bringing peace to you, but to continue imposing their own vision of the present and the future of humankind. And naturally, we as a state that wants to be an important power in a multipolar world and that claims a special role and that in that new role cannot tolerate it. We warned against it several times, but when certain red lines were crossed, we had to launch the special military operation in Ukraine, because it is Ukraine where NATO has brought its troops and weapons close to our home. The root causes of the conflict have to be addressed elsewhere, not in Ukraine. And first and foremost, I'm talking about the relationship between Russia and the West and NATO. When we talk about Caucasus, North Caucasus, and those countries that have a common border with Caucasus, we can say that the development of events there is an attempt not only to distract attention, but to create problems for Russia in that geographic location, and in order to prevent a positive resolution of the Ukrainian conflict, and most importantly, to protect the unipolar world. And that's why Russia has a different diplomatic stance, making political statements, uniting countries who accept this approach by strengthening our military forces, and so that nobody will find it effective to dictate their policy to us. If there are countries who want to see Russia as a partner, we welcome those countries. Otherwise, we'd ask the other countries to change their position.
My final question is about the U.S. sanctions. You being heavily sanctioned, obviously know more about this than almost anyone. The sanctions that are going to be imposed shortly by the U.S. Congress against Russia and apparently against Iran, from what Trump has been saying, these will obviously have an impact. But I think more than the direct impact, it will have a long-term impact, in the sense that when something is put into law, it makes it much more difficult for the government or the president, whoever, remove those sanctions. That's what we saw during the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, that many of the sanctions were never removed because the president did not have the authority to remove them. So in my opinion, this basically means that the door between Iran and the United States, Russia and the United States and the West, will be permanently shut, or at least it will be very difficult to reopen them. And that leads me to the question, and that is, I am not naive. I recognize that things take time, and financial institutions and the issue of a global currency and global trade is one of the most complex things around. But what is there a sort of timetable where countries like Iran and Russia can benefit from organizations such as BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or any other organization? They could benefit in the sense that they could ultimately find stable alternative means of trade with multiple countries, so that U.S. sanctions would have an increasingly minimal impact for ordinary people.
Let's go step by step. Sanctions are illegal actions committed by one country against another country, and it is a cul-de-sac lane of development. And such sanctions exist as long as a country is not able to demonstrate its sovereignty and its readiness to develop independently. And the sanctions will continue as long as other countries are not in position to resist those sanctions. And this is a question of time, and it is a period in the development of such countries. The illegitimate nature of such sanctions is undoubtful. If we look at Russia, Russia currently has demonstrated that the sanctions are not affecting the life in Russia and the Russian economy as it was anticipated by those states who were sanctioning us. And I should say that it is a double-edged sword. Every country has to understand that any action aimed at restricting development opportunities, whether it is China or Russia or Iran, but long-term wise, sanctions would have a negative effect on those who imposed them. And there is a reverse effect with respect to countries against whom sanctions were aimed. I can speak about Russia. In 2014, there were sanctions imposed on the Russian agrarian sector. And since then, we've become an agriculturally independent state. And moreover, our export of foodstuffs is higher than the export of weapons. If we look at 2022, I'm not that naive to say the U.S. administration for imposing the sanctions, but I can tell you that one, perhaps not the most important factor, but one of the factors of such fast-paced development of many branches of Russian economy was the sanctions imposed by the United States. We need to thank them not for imposing the sanctions, but for opening the eyes of our people and our leadership with respect to those countries. When there was a question asked our president, the question was, what are you sorry about? And he said that we trusted the West too much, which is true. We treated the West as a partner, but it turned out that it was a hidden aggressor. But what is the positive impact of the sanctions? The sanctions have demonstrated to any state, not only Russia, that the notion of sovereignty, whether economic, technological or financial, these are not void words. If we look at the world as a whole, a multipolar world means that countries would try to produce as much foodstuffs as possible, as much products as possible, so that there is no material detrimental impact on the economy inflicted. Neither Russia nor BRICS as an organization that has received an additional impetus, not because of the sanctions, but because people now realize better what the goals of many countries who impose sanctions on Russia and other states are. So the BRICS member states unite not against someone, not against a third country, but for the benefit of member states to develop an approach to stimulate the development of member states. And many countries are looking at BRICS with interest. And the recent sanctions against the Russian oil companies will see the result of those sanctions with respect to Europe and America, because the restriction of Russian oil export would not have a major impact on Russia, because if we look at our trade balance, then our account, there is a big, there is no deficit in our trade balance. And when we talk about the reduction of oil in the global market, that would be a guarantee of a future price increase, price hike. And this would hit the people of those countries who wanted to punish Russia economically. And the second question is raw materials export restriction not something that would serve as an additional impetus to keep developing processing industries and refining industries? industries, and we will see an upsurge in those industries that belong to the sphere, because in the future we're going to sell all products rather than crude, and this will continue because Russian raw materials quality is acknowledged by everyone. But this would also promote the sovereignty of Russia. And I can put it this way: it is not the sanctions who could stop us. Only our own capabilities and our upside potential can stop us. So far, the sanctions have not been an impediment, but they have been an instrument. They have been instrumental in developing our country and in developing our cooperation with other partners. We have new partners who have emerged, and it is a stated fact.
But before you jump off, Professor Marandi, I have a question both for you and for Mr. Babakov. Since the snapback sanctions, the sanctions that were never taken off, have snapped back, but we have Russia and China saying, we're not going to abide by those. We're going to deal with Iran as an economic equal, essentially. Are you seeing, first in Iran, any consequence, any immediate change in terms of economic activity vis-a-vis with Russia and China?
I think that the relationship between Iran and Russia has grown immensely over the past years, and I think no one would challenge that. The sanctions themselves, though, I think should have caused a stronger economic relationship between the two sides to develop than what we see today. That is somewhat disappointing, the pace of progress to counter exactly what you're talking about in general terms, the sanctions regime. Now, the snapback itself is a part of that broader picture. The maximum pressure sanctions obviously are supposed to be maximum. So they already include everything. Much of the talk in Iran or the Persian media that's broadcast from the West into Iran was intended to create fear about the snapback and that it would cause great harm and hardship to the Iranian economy. Back then I told people in interviews that I don't think that's going to happen, and that a few weeks after the Europeans try to use the snapback mechanism, things will go back to normal Iran, and the Iranians will see that it really didn't have an impact. One, of course, reason for that is that we're already under maximum sanctions regime, and there isn't much that this could add to it. And the second reason is the position taken by the Russian and the Chinese governments, where they said they do not recognize the revival of those UN Security Council resolutions. So I do think that the Europeans made a mistake, because it was considered by themselves and by many in Iran to be leverage for them to be able to use. But now that they've used it and it did not have the desired effect, I think it's a loss for the Europeans. But I still do stress that sanctions do bite, and they have impacted the economy in Iran. And it's been going on for many years in the case of Iran, and very severe. But there have been many positive developments. Iran became much more self-sufficient. We see in Russia. But ultimately, in order to wreck the sanctions regime, I do think that Iran and Russia have to push its partners across the world harder to develop an alternative to Western financial institutions and Western currencies, so that trade between Central Asian countries, Iran and Russia, the Caucasus, Iran and Russia, African countries, Asian countries, could become much more easy and thus beneficial for people across the global south. And I think if that happens, that would be the death of the sanctions regime altogether.
Alexander, do you see any actions that the Duma could take to, if you will, accelerate and expand economic cooperation with Iran?
Well, in fact, we are already supporting numerous decisions. You know that we have an agreement on full-scale cooperation with Iran. It was a major step forward in our relationship. There are several spheres where we are supporting the steps made by our government. Our parliament, Duma, has a special status to approve nominees to the ministerial posts, and therefore we are working in a close contact with the executive branch of our government, and I'd like to support what our colleague has said. When I visited Samarkand, I saw, when I saw it, I thought of how great this country would have been if not for the sanctions, because it is already great. How good it might have been. Yes, the sanctions are making an impact, but they cannot destroy such a great country as Iran. Therefore, I am proud of Iran for succeeding in resisting the sanctions. But it is not our goal. It is too primitive to proclaim that the goal of the government is to resist the sanctions. No, the goal is to create good conditions for the people of Iran. And we as Russia support it. The language of sanctions is the language of war. Any man who respects himself would not allow anyone to use force against him. And if he has a weakness, that man would find an alternative decision, which is not always straightforward. And Russia has been demonstrating it. There is a huge number of countries that are together with Russia, not because they like Russia, but they support our desire to protect its sovereignty. We think that it is a good step for other countries. Please allow me to ask another question to our both guests, to Alexander Babakov and to Professor Marandi. It is also related to sanctions. Alexander, you have described very well that if there is a smart resistance, sanctions do not only fail, they do not only work, but there is the boomerang effect. But there is another thing that those who impose sanctions fail to understand. It was actually there was a time when Russia and Iran used to be members of global financial institutions that were actually seized by our American partners. And those global institutions were instruments of pressure and restrictions. There was always a button that could be pressed to inflict damage on us. They took away those institutions, and the paradox is that the sanctions are releasing us from certain things. I can put it this way. If you allow me, Professor Marandi, I'll take the floor. I'll be the first to answer. If we refer to your question, I can tell you that it was not a random thing for the United States and Europe to start imposing sanctions on the financial sector, because the financial sector is the major element of the economy. And actually, the political governance was not important to them. It was important to them to find tools how to influence, to find leverage. Yes, but it was a mistake as well, because such steps had to take into account the capabilities, capacity, and upside potential of the countries that are sanctions. In my opinion, there was a time when the West managed to succeed more when it pursued this sugar and honey policy, when it used bells and whistles to embed embellish its attempts to penetrate other states without demonstrating, openly demonstrating force when they were eroding those countries internally from the inside. We witnessed it in 1990s when there were beautiful pictures and beautiful candy wrappings, but we didn't see what was behind them. But now the West believes that it is so strong that they can use the force, direct force and economic aggression against many states, and in particular against Russia. I think it is a principal mistake of the West. It is not only a miscalculation, but it is an overestimation of the effect of its efforts. And many countries, looking at Russia as an example, have seen that, oh, we are sovereign, we can resist, and most importantly, there is a different ideology that is focused on cooperation, and the world has seen it with its own eyes, and it is very difficult to take the reverse path. Professor Marandi, the same question. Is it possible that sanctions release us from some burdens?
Yes, I think there's absolutely no doubt about that. One of the positive aspects of the entire sanctions regime is that it has taught us to look to the non-Western world, the global majority, the global South, to the East, for cooperation. Even though non-Western countries were on the rise, including many of the prominent members of BRICS, but I think our Eurocentric worldview was stronger, and our resistance to change still existed. And we wanted to continue to have partnerships with those who we've been affiliated with for decades, if not centuries, even though they abused us in the past for a very long time. But I think by blocking the road trade and development, and by antagonizing our countries, and Iran, for example, in particular, they have forced Iran to open its eyes to the non-Western world and to explore opportunities for trade and business. For example, the North-South transport corridor that's being developed between Iran and Russia was agreed upon a long time ago, but the two sides really didn't get to implementing it. But then when the war in Ukraine began, the two sides suddenly took a much greater interest. So sometimes behavior of the West makes us realize that our priorities are wrong. And by changing our priorities and dealing with the world in a more creative fashion, not only is our dependence on the West lessened and to the loss of the West, but the window for us, for the future, opens more rapidly than other countries in certain ways, because we all know, for example, how China has developed. Iran and Russia are working hard, along with Russia and along with the Chinese, to develop their tribe. They're tied with one another. We do more so than probably many partners of the United States and Europe, because part of it is out of necessity. But at the same time, the future is in Asia. So by harming us, they're also pushing us harder towards the future.
Let me, this may be more of an observation, but appreciate the reaction of you both. The silver lining, it would appear to me from the sanctions, is that the relationship between Russia and Iran is closer now than it was 5 years ago. Or, 10 years ago, Russia signed off on, we'll impose those sanctions on Iran. And now it's a complete opposite. Mr. Babakov first, and then Professor Marandi.
Ну, я постараюсь.
I'll try to support this. Who could imagine that 20 years ago, the dollar would not be the global currency? They destroyed it all. We are not only looking for an alternative currency, but it is an acknowledgement of the fact. Who could imagine the situation that building infrastructure projects across the territories of different states is a guarantee for economic support of those countries? But if we look at the Nord Stream, and if we failed to build infrastructure projects on the territory of other countries, then those countries started thinking about how to deliver products through mechanisms that would protect them from physical intervention of aggressors. There are transport corridors, infrastructure corridors, economic corridors, and there are financial corridors that prevent any direct impact, any destruction. And now, in a competitive environment, dollar will have to fight against Chinese yuan, and in the future, I think it will fight with Indian rupees and ruble, because any currency is a reflection of the economic upside potential. And China is number one these days, not only because it is number one currently, but because China has a lot of upside potential. And if we look at the money mass, then it is higher than the US, Japan, and other countries' money mass. And it is a great stimulus for the development of the Chinese economy. It is developing for its own benefit, but for the benefit of other countries as well, because China is thinking about shipment ways, shipment routes, how to deliver goods. If there is a marine blockade or other blockade, is it not a direct sign for the Chinese leadership to look for alternative cooperation, ways of cooperation, and to use other countries as transit routes? And our cooperation in the transport sphere is driven by the fact that we are neighbors. Who can prevent us physically? Yes, they can, but it would pose a danger for those countries. And all these steps, in fact, have opened our eyes. Indeed, many countries, these steps are an eye-opener for many countries, and they are open for cooperation, not against someone, but for the benefit of such countries. If we united our efforts to fight against someone, we would look like that poor European Union that has united to fight against Russia, and not only against Russia. It is a pathway that leads nowhere. Uniting efforts for the development is an endless path forward. I'd like to remind you, what if someone is not aware of this information? I think it would be a reminder for Professor Marandi that there are already shipments from the north of Russia to the port of Prim in Tehran, along this transport corridor, along the eastern route. These containers go through Kazakhstan and other Central Asian countries. These are not dreams.
Yeah, Professor Marandi, we'll give you the final word, my friend.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. I think that Iran and Russia are uniquely placed to create an alternative to this Western-dominated system, with, of course, taking into account the fact that China is really the number one global economic power. And that for Iran and Russia is a huge plus. There is enormous potential, just like I said earlier about the North-South corridor, there's enormous potential for Iran and Russia today. For example, the Russian oil and gas companies that are sanctioned, they can invest in Iran. And the Persian Gulf region is open for the export of oil and gas and their derivatives. Russian oil and gas could also hypothetically go through Iran. Iran could be a hub. Same is true with grain. And the Indian Ocean would be open for the Russians without any NATO country or any pro-Western country or Western-affiliated country being able to do anything about it. And of course, the same is true with Iran. Iran has been able to purchase goods now from Russia that in the past it used to purchase from Latin America and Australia at a much higher price. So a lot has been done, as has been pointed out. A lot more can be done. And one thing that I think should be explored and is that the youth in the two countries should come to understand each other better. I know young Iranian businessmen and women who don't know Russia well. And I'm sure the same is true with Russia, and they would like to explore doing trade and business. There should be more work done at the academic level among institutions to create better understanding so that the youth in the two countries can explore the potential. Because once they do that, then I think it's really game over for the West.
My dear friend, thank you so much for your questions, your contribution. And Mr. Babakov, thank you. I think we have had an enlightening discussion, and we recognize that the future is bright as long as Russia, China, and Iran are working together. And I pray that that becomes a reality. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching. This has been a presentation of the International Unity Club, and thank you, Professor Marandi, for joining our club today.
It's my honor.
But next time, the shirt.
Definitely.
Okay, thank you.